Thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. For all the people who've been out at the General Assemblies in this weather, for all the people who actually camped out against Ford, I'm sure you have a lot more to say about this, and we really hope we can enter into a discussion. Similarly, being with such wise mentors, it's indeed an honor. Hopefully I can say something of value. So I'd like to talk briefly about what's effective in the Occupy movement and what could make it more so. As was said in the introduction, part of being on a house arrest means that though I spoke avidly with friends, I followed online, I talked to people around occupations, I only walked into Occupy Toronto really just once. On November 22nd, 6 people pled guilty and 11 had their charges dropped after one of the largest spying operation and activists in Canada. And so the 11 of us took a bus from 2201 Finch from the courthouse to Occupy Toronto. We said from the courthouse and into the streets. And there a raucous rally marched out, after it had been shown around, marched out from Occupy into the financial district and onto City Hall. And so, just like for most of you, Occupy holds a very special place in my heart, for it was a burst of freedom in a very long time. And I think that's a really good way to describe what Occupy is. It's a burst of freedom. A sudden realization for some of us that a lot, maybe anything, is possible. And freedom, I think, is the ability for each of us to participate in the decisions that impact our lives. Growing up, going to school, going to work, being pushed around by bosses or employers. Too often, the only choices we seem to have is what kind of burger to get or what size Tim Hortons to buy, right? Our freedom has consistently been stolen by corporations, by governments, by the so-called intellectual elite, by so-called movement managers. And I think Occupy encampments are in direct resistance to that. What Hakeem Bey calls a semi-permanent autonomous zone. A small space of autonomy, of freedom, that bursts, erupts on the scene, and even if suppressed, will re-emerge elsewhere. I think Occupy movements are effective because they're grounded in the struggles of the past, be it the Indignados movement, the Arab Spring, that we've heard about recently. But I want to talk about some occupations in Toronto. I want to remember the 1994 occupation of the Federal Tax Agency by 27 Native organizers in the city called Revenue Res. I want us to remember the 1999 occupation of Allen Gardens by OCAP to make safe parks free for, and safety for homeless communities in the city. I want us to remember the 2002 occupation of abandoned buildings, the so-called Pope Squat. I want us to remember how immigration organizers in 2004 occupied the immigration minister's offices in the city to stop the deportation of men charged with terrorism charges. I want us to remember 2008, when Judy, myself, and a lot of us were involved in occupying Queen's Park to get Indigenous rights recognized, to have the KI6 free, and again and again and again. We have a history of occupations in this city, and that's why Occupy is effective. I think it's also effective because Occupy is a coming of a particular kind of age. When back, there was a time in the left when there was always a question of, is it race or is it class? Is it the issue of women or is it the issue of class? The Occupy movement is a movement where questions of difference are firmly entrenched. This is why Indigenous writers, warriors, activists have responded to the idea of Occupy insert city. With the obvious response that here, on one of the last remaining occupied settler colonies, the colonizers still rule. Each of these cities are already occupied. And these conversations could not simply be pushed aside as they could possibly have been at other moments. Multiple cities like LA, Oakland, New York, Boston, Denver, to name just a few, have actually stepped forward to decolonize their perspectives, to change their ideology and their terminology. And as many of us, including many here, keep asserting to fight corporate greed, to fight the 1%, to actually exercise that freedom, that self-determination, we must begin on occupied land by supporting the sovereignty of the first occupied people. And understanding our role in being in solidarity with Indigenous nations is necessary for any movement here to be effective. And I think the Occupy movement as a whole has taken up itself to take that on. And I think movements in Ontario that are here today, will be over the next weekend, are beginning to do that and need to continue. I also think that Occupy movements are effective because we understand what economic power means, what economic freedom and economic slavery mean. We understand that the richest 1%, the corporations and the governments, wreak havoc on our lives. They destroy the environment, right? They impose the international trade agreements, where we see Canada signing agreements like NAFTA, with Israel, with India, with Colombia, with Europe, with the United States. And what are these trade agreements? What are these spaces of economic inequality and power? They're about just taking away local communities' ability to be free, right? Those are attacks on self-determination. And I think Occupy understands that. And I think that we will become more effective as we understand that this economic power is deeply linked to political power. That the economic power, these creation of free trade agreements, these corporate free trade zones, these corporate inequalities, are about the 1% consolidating their power. And that power is being consolidated here in the north. It's being consolidated amongst the richer countries, right? It's being consolidated because economic and political power are knotted together, right? So we're here in Canada, we see these countries are the 1%, right? Places where I've been raised in, the whole of this country would be considered the 1%. And so we need to understand that even though we have injustices happening upon us, that part of our work needs to be in solidarity with those places that are facing the immense suffering. And not only that, but to be in solidarity with the displaced peoples of the South, with the migrant workers that arrive here, with people of color that arrive here, with undocumented people that arrive here. Because economic power, to fight truly against the 1%, we need to understand how that political power discriminates against particular communities more than others. People of color, women, indigenous people, disabled people, queer people. And again, I think the Occupy movement is effective because it's learning, right? It's learning and it's growing. I think we're understanding that though we are the 99%, there are hierarchies in between us and within us, and we're dealing with them and we're engaging with them. And be it in the organizing of the actual encampments or assemblies like these, those conversations are actually places to change, to become, you know. So I consider myself a movement builder, right? I see part of the organizing constantly to be about building bridges. So be it the Toronto Community Mobilization Network that during the G8, G20 brought together gender justice movements, labor rights movements, indigenous sovereignty movements, and so on. Or the Toronto Stop the Cuts Network, where just 2 days ago we stopped Ford from taking $28 million in cuts from us with so many allies. We have learned that none of us can win till all of us win. And I think that is the primary lesson within the Occupy movement. When we say we are the 99%, it is a call to build a movement of all people. And I think that in North America for a really long time, public debate has been stuck, right, in this conservative right-wing agenda where we can't seem to get out of. So I work in immigration. We see the current Canadian immigration minister talking about immigrants as bogus, as fake, as queue jumpers, and we've not really been able to challenge them. But I think what honest Occupy movement is, it's an honest, effective attempt to shift that conversation, right? Because now we can finally debate corporate greed. Now we can name capitalism again. Somehow Occupy cracked through that mainstream media and occupied the imagination of millions, right? And now we can talk about the different kinds of worlds we want to live in. A polyphony rather than this boring monotony that's being forced upon us. And this is an anti-colonial victory. It's an anti-capitalist victory. And I think also, I have a list. So also what I think the Occupy movement is effective is because from its very inception, from day one, it decided to break laws. Establishing tents in a park in Toronto, illegal. March on the street without a permit, illegal. Talking about encampments, illegal. Doing trainings about all of these things, marshalling, illegal, right? Yet everyone who came to Occupy implicitly or explicitly accepted that for us to really challenge the 1%, we would have to break their laws, right? And I think that when we do that, we decided that our beliefs, our values were more important than the law. And when laws are unjust, they must be resisted. We decided to break the law because so much of what we oppose is illegal. So much of what we desire is illegal. We broke the law because these laws are made broken. Right? They were made to break us. So over and over again, we've seen in the Occupy movement people trying to make the police their friends. And over again, we have learned how that is wrong. Right? To be effective is to learn from your mistakes. And I think today, less people believe that the police are our friends. And that's why this movement is becoming more effective. I think we're learning that by simply asking politicians or corporations, by going to courts for injunctions, will not work. It did not work. Right? And so, you know, I wrote this a few months ago, where I said, to truly be free, to truly be that burst of freedom, we have to resist the laws that allow some to be rich and for the rest of us to live at their will. And I think that's true today. We must resist racism and sexism, homophobia and disableism. We must resist the very structure each of these laws is based on. We must resist colonialism. And I think our struggle cannot be to just gain permits and permissions. It must be to make it impossible for governments and corporations to enforce their laws. We need to challenge their very jurisdiction. That's what Occupy is. That's why it's effective. On Tuesday night, as Torontonians tried to enter into City Hall, a public building, and we were stopped just to be in the rotunda, or actually just, witness the votes, the police raided us. They kidnapped 4 of our comrades. And so in the hundreds, we went to 52 Division with many members of Occupy Toronto. And we asserted that we would leave no one behind. An effective movement is one that takes care of everyone on its side of the barricades. And I think on Tuesday, Occupy Toronto showed that. I also think that Occupy is an effective response to austerity. And I'll just end here. And so what is austerity? Austerity is a massive transfer of wealth. It's a theft from our public services to police. It's a theft from our public services to building armies, to building prisons, to building detention centers. It's a theft from our public services while we see anti-immigrant rhetoric rise, while we see an attack on unions, right? It's money being taken away from our public services and given as a bailout to corporations, to oil and mining gas companies. So those are the fronts we need to talk about. Because when we talk about Occupy, we can talk about corporations, but we need to talk about prisons. We need to talk about xenophobia. We need to talk about the attack on unions. Because those are deeply connected. And so, the tents have been taken down. It's winter. But as the old cliche goes, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And so I think it's time for new strategies, to join neighborhood organizing, to prepare to take over schools, shelters, food banks, childcare centers in this city, because the province and the feds and the city think they're going to take that away from us. And we've got to stop them. On January 24th, the Executive Committee of City Hall will debate selling off public housing. They can and they must be stopped. In March, both the provincial government and the federal government will try and push through budgets that will steal money from our services to give it to corporations, to attacking immigrants, to building prisons, and to wage war. They can and they must be stopped. In KI, a northern territory just outside of Ontario, there's a mining company that's going to go and try to mine on that land. They can and they must be stopped. Right? For decades in this city, we've seen organizations talk about the need for community services, community centers, communities to be run by us. Right? That's what self-determination, freedom, and autonomy means. We must have the power to run our own communities. That's what we know in illegal call a sanctuary city. That's what people call self-determination. That's what it means to actually make it impossible for them to impose their just laws. It can be done. It must be done. Thank you.